Here's what he had to say to Jake Tapper the other night. Roll it.
For Israel, there's an increasing delegitimization campaign that has been building up. People are very sensitive to it. There's talk of boycotts and other kinds of things.
The response from some Israeli politicians was furious. The Israeli economic minister, for example, fired back, "We expect our friends around the world to stand beside us against anti-Semitic boycott efforts targeting Israel and not to be their trumpet."
What's your response to these very harsh attacks from our allies, the Israelis?
My comments need to be properly represented, not distorted. I did not do anything except cite what other people are talking about as a problem, but I also have always opposed boycotts. I have a 100% voting record in support of Israel for 29 years in the United States Senate. Unfortunately, there are some people in Israel and in Palestine and in the Arab world and around the world who don't support the peace process. There are specifically some people who don't support two states. There are some people who don't want any restraint on settlements whatsoever.
So he warns against, if peace talks fail, Israel's going to be subject and going to face more boycotts. And then you heard his rationalization and explanation for that statement, or at least part of it. Your thoughts?
Well, Crane, of course, we're seeing much more verbal assaults against Israel from people within our presidential administration right now in our government. But this is really rooted long before Obama. Our State Department has been anti-Israel. We saw it under President Bush's administration. The roadmap to peace was crafted largely by King Abdullah of Jordan, who's a distant relative of Mohammed. And the roadmap to peace calls for the division of Gaza, which under President Bush was divided in 2005, calls for the West Bank being given back to the Palestinians, the Golan Heights being given back to Palestinians, and for Jerusalem to be divided as a city and given half the east side to the Palestinians. So this roadmap to peace, Crane, was designed by our State Department in the Quartet of Nations, Russia, U.S., the European Union, and the United Nations. And so basically, Kerry is just following along with this roadmap, pushing for a two-state solution. But now it seems that this administration is much more verbal in their attacks against Israel. It seems that they are throwing Israel under the bus. But my concern now, Crane, is, it says in Zechariah chapter 12 that all the nations of the earth will rise up against Israel. And again, I've said this before, I never thought America would be part of that, but Scripture is true, all the nations of the earth. And it says in verse 2 of Zechariah 12, "Behold, I'm about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah." And so Kerry is just following along with the talking points of the roadmap to peace, which was established actually under a Republican administration.
That's an excellent point, Aaron. And it also, the idea of calling something a peace process like this, that kind of, it makes me sick to my stomach. It doesn't kind of. It makes me sick to my stomach because the peace process implies that you have two partners that are on the same moral plane and that they are equally committed to the same foundational values. They're obviously not. Your thoughts?
Exactly. And there, many times I was in Jerusalem. It seemed like in my journeys to Jerusalem during the Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice was always flying in right about the time I was flying in. Mm-hmm. And she would come into the city, she would hold a press conference, and line by line, not as aggressive as Kerry, but line by line would make statements like, we're going to take Gaza, we're going to take Hebron, we're going to take Jerusalem. And so I found that remarkable from a Republican administration. But this is neither Republican or Democrat. This is a State Department policy that's been in the works for probably 20 or 30 years that's now coming to fruition because it seems that the rest of the world is turning against Israel. And Kerry made a veiled threat there, and I think you and I would agree that when he said there's going to be boycotts against Israel, it was a veiled threat that the United States would support those boycotts.
I just pray for the day that we have an administration that somehow doesn't get impacted by the drug of the peace process, because that's what it has to be. And I know many of you will say, what do you mean? You always accuse people who disagree with you of being on drugs. Well, sometimes there's no real other way to put it, and I think it just kind of makes it clear. I'm trying to illustrate how convoluted their logic is, and how it is a cut and dry issue when it comes to, I would say, arguably the ally in the region, certainly our greatest ally in the region, I would say our greatest ally in the world, and our treatment of Israel. There's no gray area here, and whether it's the conspiracy theorists or the replacement theology group or groups, or it's just the enemies of Israel as we know them, who do not recognize their existence and desire to push them into the sea or remove them from the map, and then us. I think we need very clear thinking, and I wish we had that, and I pray for that.